Roy Jones Jr. was untouchable, too fast to hit.
Get past the midway point.
A little heavily at the end of that. Beautiful shots back at Tony.
Going forward does not mean self.
Competitive fight.
Too skilled to outbox. For years, the world watched him move through boxing like a man playing a completely different sport. Champions looked helpless. Legends looked ordinary. Many believed nobody alive could truly beat him. But then came the night everything changed. One brutal punch shattered the illusion of invincibility and triggered one of the most shocking declines in combat sports history. How could a fighter who once looked superhuman suddenly collapse in front of the world? And was the downfall of Roy Jones Jr. avoidable or inevitable from the very beginning? The boxer who broke reality. Before the downfall, there was dominance unlike anything boxing had ever seen. Roy Jones Jr. wasn't just winning fights, he was humiliating elite opponents while making impossible movements look effortless. His reflexes were supernatural. Hands dropped to his waist, chin exposed, yet nobody could touch him cleanly. Fighters trained their entire lives to master fundamentals, but Roy ignored many of boxing's rules and still destroyed champions. That made him terrifying. He turned speed into a weapon so dangerous that opponents froze under pressure before punches even landed. Crowds weren't simply watching a boxer. They were watching an athletic phenomenon rewriting what seemed physically possible inside a ring. Then came history. Roy moved through multiple weight divisions and captured titles while barely showing signs of struggle. Analysts debated whether anyone in the sport's history had ever possessed that combination of reflexes, explosiveness, and confidence. By the early 2000s, his aura felt untouchable. Nobody imagined the end could arrive so suddenly. But hidden beneath the greatness was a dangerous truth most fans ignored at the time. What happens when a fighter depends on physical gifts that no human can keep forever? And what if those gifts disappeared overnight without warning at all? The dangerous decision that changed everything. In 2003, Roy Jones Jr. achieved something extraordinary. He moved up to heavyweight and defeated John Ruiz, becoming one of the rare fighters in history to jump from middleweight to heavyweight and win a world title. It looked like another impossible achievement added to an already mythical career. Fans celebrated the victory as proof Roy could conquer any challenge placed before him. But behind the scenes, his body was paying a brutal price. To compete at heavyweight, Roy added significant muscle and mass. Then came the dangerous part. Instead of remaining at heavyweight, he decided to cut the weight back down rapidly for future fights. Experts later argued that this decision drained the explosiveness and reaction speed that made him special. Roy still looked fast compared to ordinary fighters, but ordinary speed was never enough for him. His entire style relied on split-second reactions and unreal athleticism. Losing even a fraction of that edge changed everything. At first, the warning signs were subtle. He still won fights. He still carried confidence. But something felt different. Punches that once missed him by inches now came closer than before. Opponents started believing they had a chance. And then one dangerous rival stepped into the ring, ready to test whether the king was finally vulnerable forever. The punch that shocked the world. On May 15, 2004, the impossible finally happened. Antonio Tarver faced Roy Jones Jr. in their rematch, and boxing fans expected Roy to prove the first fight's criticism wrong. The opening moments felt tense but familiar. Roy still moved with confidence, still carried flashes of brilliance, and still believed he controlled the ring. Then, everything changed in seconds. Tarver landed a perfectly timed left hook directly on Roy's chin. The shot was clean, violent, and unforgettable. Roy collapsed instantly onto the canvas while the arena exploded in disbelief. Commentators sounded stunned. Fans watching around the world could barely process what they had witnessed. The fighter who once seemed impossible to hurt had been knocked out cold in brutal fashion. More importantly, it wasn't just a defeat. It felt symbolic. The aura was gone. The fear opponents once carried suddenly disappeared. For years, fighters entered the ring already mentally beaten against Roy. After Tarver's knockout, that psychological advantage vanished forever. Opponents no longer saw a superhuman genius standing across from them. They saw a man who could be hurt, pressured, and stopped. But was this merely one bad night for a legendary boxer? Or had boxing just witnessed the beginning of a tragic collapse nobody could stop anymore, when invincibility completely disappeared? After the Tarver knockout, many fans hoped Roy Jones Jr. would recover and reclaim his throne. Great champions lose sometimes. Boxing history is filled with legends who return stronger after defeat. But what followed shocked the sport even more. Roy no longer looked like the same fighter. The speed remained in flashes, yet the reactions that once protected him from danger were fading quickly. Then came another disaster. In 2004, Glenn Johnson knocked Roy out brutally again. This time, the damage felt impossible to deny. Fans watching the fight witnessed something heartbreaking: a legend struggling against the reality of time and punishment. Roy still possessed skill, experience, and courage, but his style depended heavily on reflexes that naturally decline with age. Without those gifts operating at their peak, he became vulnerable in ways nobody imagined during his prime years. The most painful part was psychological. Fans remembered the untouchable superstar who toyed with elite fighters for fun. Seeing that same man repeatedly hurt inside the ring felt almost unreal. Discussions changed from "Can anyone beat Roy Jones Jr.?" to "Should Roy retire before things become worse?" Yet despite the warnings, despite the knockouts, Roy kept fighting. And that decision would divide boxing fans for many years afterward across the entire sport. Fighting the shadow of his former self as years passed, Roy Jones Jr. continued stepping into the ring long after many believed he should retire. Some fans admired the passion, others viewed it as tragic. The problem was unavoidable comparisons to his younger self. Prime Roy had set standards so impossibly high that every later performance felt disappointing beside the memories people carried. The knockouts continued across different stages of his late career. Younger fighters targeted his fading reactions, knowing the legendary reflexes no longer saved him consistently. Yet, Roy refused to walk away quietly. He kept chasing moments that reminded audiences of the old magic. Occasionally, flashes appeared: a quick combination, a slick defensive move, a confident smile after landing a sharp counter. For brief moments, fans could almost believe the old king had returned. But the illusion never lasted long. Time always caught up again. What made Roy's decline so emotional was the contrast. Most boxers never experienced greatness remotely close to his peak. Even diminished, he remained more talented than countless professionals. But boxing fans judge legends differently. They compare greatness against immortality. And when someone once looked unbeatable, every weakness becomes impossible to ignore. Still, despite all the criticism and painful defeats, Roy's story carried one final question. Was his legacy truly destroyed by the downfall, or did his prime years remain untouchable forever? Why boxing will never forget him? Despite the painful ending, Roy Jones Jr. remains one of the most gifted fighters boxing has ever witnessed. Younger fans who only saw the late career losses sometimes struggle to understand why older generations speak about him with near-mythical admiration. But those who watched his prime remember something unforgettable. They remember a fighter who moved beyond normal expectations and transformed boxing into performance art. Very few athletes change how people think a sport can be played. Roy did exactly that. His style inspired future fighters to experiment with speed, creativity, and unpredictability. Analysts still debate where his peak ranks among the greatest primes in boxing history. Some even argue Prime Roy defeats almost anyone from any era because his athleticism was so unique. That debate alone reveals how extraordinary he truly was. Yet perhaps his story carries a darker lesson too. Boxing eventually takes something from everyone. Reflexes slow, timing fades, punishment accumulates. Even the most untouchable champions cannot escape time forever. Roy's collapse felt shocking precisely because his greatness looked eternal before it disappeared. And maybe that is why fans still talk about him today. Not simply because he fell apart, but because for one unbelievable period, he looked almost impossible to destroy. So, could boxing ever witness another fighter like Roy again someday? The story of Roy Jones Jr. is one of boxing's greatest contradictions. A fighter so dominant that fans believed he existed beyond normal human limits, yet vulnerable enough to experience one of the sport's most heartbreaking declines. His downfall shocked the world because people weren't prepared to watch greatness disappear in real time. But even after the knockouts, the criticism, and the painful final years, Roy's prime remains unforgettable. When boxing fans discuss the most talented fighters ever, his name still enters the conversation instantly. Not because of how his career ended, but because of how impossibly brilliant he once was. The speed, the reflexes, the confidence, the feeling that anything could happen once the bell rang. And maybe that's the reason his story still fascinates millions today. Because legends don't become immortal through perfection alone. Sometimes they become unforgettable through both their rise and their fall.